Hi everybody, welcome to Chapter 4, Recurring Victimization. So we talked about a little bit in Chapter 3 that people who are victimized once are at an increased likelihood of being victimized again. So there are a couple of categories about victimization that happens on more than one occasion that I need you to know the distinction between. And the first is going to be recurring victimization. And recurring victimization is a person or a place that is victimized more than once by any type of victimization. We're going to contrast that with repeat victimization, and that's when a person or a place is victimized more than once by the same type of victimization. Finally, we're going to look at re-victimization, and that is when a person is victimized more than once by any type of victimization, but across a wide time span. So, for example, from childhood to adulthood, experiencing sexual abuse throughout that time span. There's also something called polyvictimization. And polyvictimization is a recurring form of victimization through childhood where multiple different forms of victimization occur. So, for example, this is going to be a child who is physically abused by parents, who is also maybe sexually abused by neighbors. There's different kinds of abuse occurring from different outlets. Next, there's something that we call near repeat victimization, and this is when a person or a place is victimized in close proximity to a previous person or a place who was victimized. So I know that's a mouthful. Let's break that down with an example. Examples would be multiple burglaries in a neighborhood are near repeat victimization, where you see, the house six doors down from me was burglarized last night, but 2 weeks ago the house 4 doors down in the other direction was victimized. That's going to be an example of near repeat victimization. So they're being victimized in close physical geographical proximity to one another. There are certain categories of victimization that are likely to happen more than once, and examples of those are going to be domestic violence. So domestic violence tends to be chronic victimization, rape, assault, property victimization, and sexual victimization of all kinds, not just forcible rape. There's a strong relationship there between one-time victimization and subsequent victimization. There is also a very strong relationship between early sexual assaults early in life and subsequent sexual assaults occurring throughout someone's life course. So if you were sexually assaulted in some capacity at a younger age, the odds that you will be victimized sexually throughout your life course are actually greatly increased. There's an issue of time course. So when I say time course, the thing that we're focusing on here is how soon after initial victimization will the individual experience their next victimization. So for example, we see with repeat burglaries, 25% of burglaries that happen when they are repeat burglaries happen within 1 week of the original burglary. And that's what we would call the time course. That's that 1 week time lapse, right? It's an interesting thought, and just sort of a little bit of a breakdown of that is, you get burglarized, they come to your home, they want to get in and out really quick with as much as they can. While they're there, they see what you have. They're like, we got to get out before we get caught. But you know what? There's still a lot of really good stuff in that house. We need to get back there and get it before they A, target harden and make it harder to get into their house, and B, while we know that those items are still there. Okay, so that's the issue of time course, right? That there is an elapsed time, there's a re-victimization, but it's not a willy-nilly, it's not typically willy-nilly that time lapse. There's a reason and a method to that time lapse. Other sort of examples, 35% of all domestic violence repeats are likely to happen within 5 weeks of the original incident. Again, you're going to see that the offenders are going to be angry about getting arrested. 5 weeks later, they're back home, right? Usually, typically, depending on the level or the what's happening in the criminal justice system with their circumstance, they're agitated with the victim for their response, etc. So we see that time lapse. Knowing that there's a time lapse with certain categories of crime drives our policy and our prevention efforts. So if we know that somebody's been burglarized, we can say to them, law enforcement can say to them, hey, in cases like this, it's not at all uncommon that they will come back and that they will come back very soon. So we need to target harden your property. Maybe you want to think about getting a security system. Maybe you want to think about installing more deadbolts. Maybe you want to think about installing cameras, Ring cameras. Get a dog, right? So this can drive policy and prevention, knowing these time course and these elapsed issues. There's also something called victim proneness, and that's the likelihood that a victim of crime will experience the same type of crime again in the future. So things like theft, rape, sexual coercion, and burglary all demonstrate victim proneness. These are all examples of victimization, that the victim of the original assault is likely to experience that same type of victimization again in the future. There are also what we call individual level risk factors of victimization. So just some rules of thumb that we've learned over many, many years of examining victimization data. Males are more likely than females to be victimized. Generally speaking, when we look at all categories of crime, happens more to males than females. Younger people are more likely to be victimized than older people. Single, divorced, or separated people are more likely to be victimized than those who are in consistent relationships. People in low socioeconomic status areas, people who have low incomes, are more likely to be victimized than people with middle incomes or high incomes. Unemployed people are more likely to be victimized than employed people. African Americans are more likely to be victimized than are their white counterparts. All of these things tend to have driving factors behind them, right? So younger people take more risks than older people, which is going to put them at greater risk for victimization. Single people have less guardianship, right? You're living alone versus living with a partner, right? People who have low incomes are more likely to live in low income neighborhoods. Low income neighborhoods are more likely to be socially disorganized or to have a presence of high crime. So you can explain all of these issues, all of these risk factors can be explained, right? But the fact of the matter is just identifying the risk factor is enough for us to know who's at greater risk of victimization. Um, Also, activities and behaviors contribute to victimization. So, for example, those who spend their nights away from home are more likely to be victimized than people who are just at home regularly. So, whether that's because you travel for work and you're out and about, you are, you're putting yourself out there to potential crime offenders, right? You're not at home where you can target harden and lock down, etc. Chronically utilizing public transportation after 6 p.m. increases the risk of victimization. Once again, we're going to say it again. Alcohol use increases your risk of recurring victimization. Individuals with mental illness and cognitive disabilities are at greater risk for recurring victimization. Living in an urban location puts you at greater risk for recurring victimization. Again, why? There's more crime in densely populated urban locations. Living in areas with high concentrations of single parent headed households are at greater risk for victimization that recurs. Again, that lack of guardianship. There's one adult in the house instead of two. It makes you more vulnerable. Living in neighborhoods characterized by social disorder and social disorganization puts you at a greater risk for having recurring victimization. So this begs the question. Now we have all of these risk factors that we identify, but why are so many individuals at risk for that recurring victimization? The first explanation is something that we're going to call risk heterogeneity, which is also known as the flag explanation. Excuse me, these are the qualities that put a person at risk of victimization that are going to keep them at risk of further victimization if those qualities remain unchanged. What does that mean in practice? Well, you're at greater risk of victimization if you live in a socially disorganized area. If you keep living there, you are at greater risk for recurrent victimization because you haven't changed that original quality. That original risk factor is still there. It hasn't changed. So you are going to be at greater risk until you change that circumstance. There's something called boost explanation. And boost explanation is how the victim and the offender act during victimization is going to predict whether or not recurrent victimization occurs. So, for example, if a sexual assault victim has a weapon and fights back, she is learning her power. She's empowering herself. She's taking agency in her victimization. And her assailant, in response, is learning that she's not an easy target. So I'm not going to come back to this one. But the one who doesn't fight back, the one who doesn't take steps to make it harder for her to be victimized, is more vulnerable, more easily victimized. So let's recur over there. There's something called compounding vulnerability, and this is when multiple factors play off of the first victimization, which increases the likelihood of recurrent attacks. So, for example, somebody in a low socioeconomic status neighborhood is victimized. They become anxious or depressed as a result, which are very common emotional and psychological reactions to victimization, which leads them to be identifiably vulnerable, right? You are now vulnerable. That person has anxiety. That person's depressed. That person is, you know, therefore increasing their rate of re-victimization or potential for re-victimization. There's also negative state dependence, and that's recurring victimization that becomes less likely because of the original victimization, makes the individual more aware of their vulnerability. Maybe you just had poor self-awareness, you had poor situational awareness that the way you were living your life, where you were going, the way you were carrying yourself, the decisions you were making, whatever, were making you vulnerable and you just didn't know. But then you got victimized and you became very hyper aware of what it is that led to your victimization, and that awareness of your vulnerability made you take steps to minimize that vulnerability. You make different decisions about how you get to work. Instead of traveling by foot, maybe now you travel by car. You make different decisions which minimize that risk of being re-victimized. So ultimately, why do we want to know this stuff? Well, because we want to prevent recurrent victimization. How do we do that? We want to target those risk factors. The first step is identifying the risk factors and knowing that you're at risk. We've already done that through research, through gathering data, through victimology. We know the risk factors. But once we know those risk factors, what can we do to mitigate your risk factors, to eliminate your risk factors? And we want to mitigate, minimize your vulnerability, and eliminate as many of those risk factors as possible in order to make sure that your victimization is a one-time stop, not something that occurs again and again and again throughout your life course.